Most applications that you write sooner or later will require data to be placed on the page either for display or for editing or both. That data might come from SQL Server, from an XML file, from a business object, or from almost any place. You could handle the page lifecycle events yourself. That is, you would load data into the controls as the page originally renders, and then as users are done with the data, you'd save it back to its data source. On the other hand, ASP.NET Data Binding does that work for you. Because of the ability of data source controls to load data when necessary and bound controls to bind to the data source controls, you really don't have to do much work at all. As a matter of fact, for the simplest applications, you have to write no code at all. That was really Microsoft's point, was to make it possible to write applications with no code and make it possible to make these controls do exactly what you want with very little code. They've done all the grunt work. All you have to do is the application-specific coding. ASP.NET includes several data source controls. We'll look at a number of them through the next few sections. These data source controls perform standard data operations automatically, that is, select, insert, update, and delete, and sorting and filtering, all without any code on your part. They really don't provide any sort of user interface. They're invisible at runtime. They do their work under the covers. They handle the page lifecycle and its events. They know when the page is loading, and they can get the data at that point. They know when the page is closing, and they can do what they need to do to preserve your data. They also scale up to scenarios that involve code. Sometimes you just can't solve a problem without writing code, and they have a large number of events you can hook code to solve almost any sort of problem. They also allow you to set their behavior declaratively. You don't need to write code just to make them do stuff at load time or when it's time to save data. All that happens just by setting properties. They support integrated caching, so you don't need to worry about caching the data. And they make it all really easy, at least in this simple case. You'll find these controls included in the ASP.NET Toolbox. There's a SQL data source control, which works with SQL data sources, and that includes just about anything that uses structured query language. There's the object data source, which works with middle-tier business objects. There is the link data source, which works with link data sources, and we'll look at an example of that later on. The XML data source allows you to read XML data and bind controls to it. And the sitemap data source, which is really outside the scope of this section, talks about setting up a data source that maps the view of your site and its layout onto user interface on the page. Each one of these provides some design time support. Some controls provide more design time support than others. On the other side, we have controls that can be bound to the data source controls. Lots of controls can be bound. They bind to data that's exposed from a data source at design time. The beautiful part of this is you lay this all out at design time, so you don't have to write any code to perform the binding at runtime. At runtime, the data source control fetches the data at the appropriate time in the life cycle of the page. Optionally, you can take advantage of specific data source capabilities. For example, the grid view can sort data only if the underlying data source supports sorting the data. There are a large number of data-bound controls, including the tree view, radio button list, list box, data list, add rotator, repeater, and the grid view control, of course, drop-down list, bulleted list, details view, checkbox list, the menu control, and the list view control, which is new in this version of ASP.NET. You can use any of these controls with the data source controls we'll be looking at throughout this section and the next one. Let's start by looking at the SQL data source control. This control makes it easy to interact with any data source for which there is an ADO.NET provider. The SQL in the name refers to any data source that uses structured query language. It's not limited to SQL Server. It worked with OLEDB, ODBC, Access, Oracle, and so on. As long as structured query language is the language of creating queries, this data source will work. You provide the connection string and the provider, the control does the rest. Let's try a demo that shows off how to work with the SQL data source control. In the sample project for this chapter named Data Binding, I've added a new web page named products.aspx that wasn't there already. So I'm set up and ready to go to add controls to this page. Now, although it isn't necessary, the page will look nicer if we give it a decent style. So I'm going to drag on this style sheet here, just so it gets a style that I'm more comfortable with. You'll learn about styles in a different portion of this course. Let's look at the data source controls to see what's available to us. To make that possible, I'll display the toolbox window. There it is. Now in the toolbox window, I'm going to drag down here until I find the Data tab. If we open the Data tab, we'll see a list of all the controls you're most likely to use in a data situation and the data source controls. Notice, by the way, there's an Access data source control here. If you're working with an Access database, you might want to use that. But for real websites, the Access Jet engine really wasn't meant for multiple distributed users accessing it at the same time. It's great for demos, perhaps, but I didn't even mention it because for real websites, you're unlikely to use it. I'm going to take the SQL data source control and drag it onto the page. You can see that there's really no design time experience for that control. It's just a blob on the page. But there is this Smart tag here, which allows me to choose tasks. And the only task that's important right now is to configure the data source. So I'll click that link, and we have an option now to configure the data source. The first thing you'll find is a list of available connections. On your computer, you may not already have created a connection to the Northwind sample database. I have in this project, so it should show up here. But if ever you come here and you don't see any connections, click New Connection. You'll see this dialog box. You can choose the name of your server, which for me would be dot, which means the local machine, slash SQL Express, which is the instance of SQL Server I'm working with. It's named SQL Express. And on your computer, that should work the same way if you've installed Visual Studio using the default settings. And down here, you can choose from the available databases. I've installed the Northwind sample database, and that's what I'll be using for my demonstrations. I don't need to create this new connection, so I'll click Cancel because I already have connections created for me. This is the one I've created already in this project, and this is the one that's been set up on my machine from use in previous projects. I'll use this one for this data source. Notice how they hide the connection string from you. The only reason I can guess this is it might contain private information, and Evil Bob might be hanging out over your shoulder, and you don't want Evil Bob to see your private information in your connection string. Once you confirm there's no one looking over your shoulder, you can click the plus sign to investigate the connection string and verify that it is correct. We'll go on to the next page, and here you can configure your select statement. For our purposes, we're going to need from the products table, well, let's go get the products table. There it is. We're going to need product ID and product name. My theory is friends don't let friends type SQL in public, and here we are. I don't want to type SQL in front of you, so I've used this designer to do it. We could, of course, specify a custom SQL statement or stored procedure, and then type the SQL statement ourselves. But I find it easier to use this designer for most of my demonstrations. I can click the Order By button to provide a sorting or ordering on this information. So if I come here, I can sort by any column, and I'll choose product name. I could supply a secondary or third level sort if I wanted, just by adding more options here. I can choose ascending or descending as well. We'll look more at the Where button later on, but on the Advanced button, you see that you can have this data source generate insert, update, and delete statements. For now, we're going to be filling the contents of a combo box a drop-down list, so I really don't want to generate insert, update, and delete statements. I want the data to be read-only, so I'll leave that alone. Let's go to the next page, and here we can test the query, and you'll see there are the 2 columns of data we've requested in the correct order. We'll finish up, and now our data source is ready so that at runtime it can retrieve the necessary data. I'm going to add a drop-down list to the page to bind to that data source. Let's go get one. Here we go. Drag it into that div tag there, and now you'll notice it too has a smart tag with a couple of tasks on it. First of all, I need to enable auto postback. I generally forget to do that unless I do it right away, so I'll enable auto postback, and now I need to choose the data source. I could choose edit items if my intent was to add the items manually, but it's not. I'm binding to a data source, so I'll choose the data source now. Here I can select from the list of available data sources or create a new one. Well, I'll use an existing one, SQLDataSource 1, and let me give you a tip. You really want to supply an ID property for your data sources because you'll have multiple on your page, and it's hard to know which one does what unless you give it a reasonable name. In this case, I only have a few. It's just a demo, so I'll leave the name as it was. Here, I'm going to select a data field to display in the drop-down list. Well, do we want to display product ID or product name? Well, I really want to display product name. For the value, I do want to use product ID, and you should note something important about this dialog box. At one point in its career, Microsoft developers were really loath to fill in items with default values. I can remember a time where this dialog would have popped up, and these fields would have been empty. Well, the problem is if you leave them empty, you're wrong 100% of the time. You have to put something in there. If they're empty, you definitely have the wrong solution. Starting in Visual Studio 2005, the Microsoft developers started guessing based on the data you had in the data source. In this case, they got it right 50% of the time, which is a lot better than getting it wrong 100% of the time. All I had to do was change the data field to display to be product name, and we're ready to go. That's really all there is. Our drop-down list now is ready to display a list of products. If I right-click on the page and choose View in Browser, of course we do have some unsaved changes. Let's save them first. The page appears, and it's full of a list of products, as you might expect. What's going on? Well, let's look at the source here. If I view the source, you'll see that what I have is a normal select control, whose name is drop-down list once. There is some JavaScript being called here. Really, we don't care about that at the moment. And you'll see all the options listed as they should be. So all ASP.NET did was generate that select control for us. And it seems to work without any effort on our part. No code at all needed to be written. All you were doing when you set those properties was creating markup, the HTML markup for the page. We could investigate, but it doesn't really matter at this point what it's doing. I'll switch to source view so we can investigate what's going on with this SQLDataSource control in that markup. You can see here in the source, let me get some room here, that we've set up within the source 2 controls, the drop-down list and the SQLDataSource. Importantly, within this SQLDataSource, we have this connection string attribute, which uses a replaceable token to replace with the Northwind connection string from my web.config file. This connection string was built when we first created the project. You'll also find up here in the drop-down list markup that we have a data source ID, which refers to SQLDataSource 1, that's this, and a data text field attribute and a data value field attribute. Those things define the markup for this drop-down list control. Now, I do want to say one more thing about this connection string. This syntax, that is, angle bracket %$, provides a declarative way to retrieve the connection string from web.config. That's a custom expression builder, and it is the connection string expression builder class doing the work. If you're interested, you might look up connection string expression builder in the online help, and you'll see how that class does its work, retrieving the connection string from the web.config file. And although you might want to create a SQL string as we've done here, you also might want to call a stored procedure. Let's see how you might do that. Let's come back up here, configure the data source, and this time specify a custom SQL statement or stored procedure. Here you can either type your SQL statement directly or choose a stored procedure to retrieve the data. In the Northwind sample database, there really isn't a stored procedure that retrieves this information for us. But if there was one, we could select it. And we would need to provide that stored procedure for the update, insert, and delete tabs because you'd need a separate stored procedure for each of those things. In addition, you could choose the query builder here if you're building your own SQL statement. The query builder works, well, like query builders you may have seen in other products that allow you to choose fields and fill in values in this table to build the SQL query, well, on the fly. For our purposes, however, we can happily use this designer to set up everything we need for this demonstration. You should note, however, that in a real application, you'll most likely want to use a stored procedure to retrieve, insert, update, and delete your data. It centralizes your processing on the SQL server instead of in the web page. Well, now that you've made it possible for the users to select a product, you might want to allow them to view information about the product and maybe even edit it. To do that, we'll look at the Details View control, and you'll see how to bind it to a data source. The Details View control makes it easy to display multiple columns of data at the same time within a formatted layout. Now, because each of these data source controls manages its own connection and command, we'll need a separate data source control to show us data from a single row in the products table. To do that, let's go add another data source. Here we are. Let's drag it over, and now we have SQL Data Source 2. Let's configure this one. It starts out the same way. We choose the same connection. We'll use products again. This time we want all the columns. And we also want to allow users to update data. So I'll go to the Advanced tab and choose Generate, Insert, Update, and Delete statements. We could use optimistic concurrency. That changes the way concurrency conflicts occur. I don't have a need to do that at this point since I'm the only one using this application. We don't really have anything else we need to do for this data source, so let's click Next. We can test it, though it's not very interesting. There we go. And let's click Finish. All right, so let's drag from the toolbox a Details View control. There's the Details View. We'll drag it into our div tag. There it is. Now this control, which displays a row of data in a vertical fashion in a little table layout, allows us to format itself. We can choose from any number of built-in formats, and some marketing person made their job creating these. I have no idea why the names mean what they mean. Rainy Day, I can see that one. But Apple Orchard, I see neither apples nor orchards. It's like they named it, but someone forgot to actually apply a style to it, because it's not very interesting. We'll go back to colorful, choose OK, and this is just a, suggestion of a style. You can always go back to the Properties window for this control and override any of the built-in formatting. Now we need to choose a data source. I don't need SQL Data Source 1 because it only provides 2 columns. I need SQL Data Source 2, which gives me all the columns. You can even see here at design time, they retrieve the schema and display it in the Details View control. I want to enable paging, enable inserting, enable editing, and enable deleting. So all these things will be on by default. We could edit fields at this point, and you'll see a list of all the fields that are being displayed in this control. You can add new ones, you can rearrange them, you can delete them. We'll leave that alone for now. I do want to modify this control just a little bit. So let's go to the Properties window. I'll bring that up here by pressing F4. And let's find the width property and set that to 400 pixels. There we go. And now I need to shrink the size of the field header. So let's find the field header style property. There it is. Expand it and set its width to 50 pixels. There we go. So now we have a narrow column header, but more room for the actual data. Let's look at the pager settings to see how we can affect what they look like. Here are the pager settings. And you'll see that here we can specify things like a URL for the image for the first page, last page, next page, and previous page if we wanted to use an image on those buttons. We can also just specify text. You can see the first page text right now is 2 less than symbols. The last page text is 2 greater than symbols, and so on. We can also specify what the mode is. Right now it's numeric, which shows us numbers for each of the pages. I really want just next, previous, first, and last to display on my pager. So we'll choose that instead. I think we're ready to display this thing. Let me save the project. I'll save the solution file, doesn't hurt anything. And let's come right-click and view in browser. There we are. You see we can page through these things, and we're seeing one row of data at a time. I can choose Edit, come here and change this, and it gets saved. So editing works fine without me doing anything at all. I can add a new one if I like, and this gives me an empty set of fields to fill in. I'll cancel that for now. I can also try to delete this. So let's delete this item. Well, that can't be good. Well, it's clear why you can't delete it. There's referential integrity rules within the Northwind sample database. You really can't delete a product because there are orders that are using this product. So we'll have to work around this ugly page here. We also have one problem. The whole point of this exercise was to choose a product from the drop-down list and see information about that product down here. So what are we missing? Well, we'll have to do a little bit of work. One other thing you should note. Right now, all of these items appear just as plain labels, and when I go to edit them, they appear as a text box. You have some control over this behavior. We won't talk about it here. We'll talk about the same feature more when we discuss the grid view control. But you can always, when you're editing a field, convert that field into a template field. A template field allows you to define the behavior of the field, and you can even replace, for example, a text box with a drop-down list. So you could have a combo box appear while you're editing one of the fields. Again, we'll discuss this more when we're working with the grid view control in a later section. Well, now how do we perform this filtering? To do that, you might think you modify the details view itself, but the details view is just getting its data from its data source. So what we really want to do is modify the SQLDataSource that fills this details view control. You can either find the data source directly, or in this Smart tag, choose Configure Data Source, and that will take you to the right place. Here we're looking at SQLDataSource 2. Let's go configure it. We need to add a where clause. On the Add Where Clause dialog box, I need to tell this details view control to filter itself such that the product ID is equal to, you can see here are the operators, the source is going to be another control. The control ID was drop-down list 1. We don't need a default value here because the drop-down list always has a default value. Now I've set up the parameter for my where clause. I just need to add it. And now you'll see that there is a new SQL expression that's been added to the SQL statement, which is I only want this data where product ID equals a parameter named @productID, and the value of @productID will be satisfied by getting the selected value from drop-down list 1. We click OK. You can see there's our where clause. We can now test this thing. It's going to ask us for the parameter. I'll pick a product ID of 4, say. And there's our one single row of data that we'll see within the details view. So I think this will work out. Oh, one more thing. On the details view, we really don't want to enable paging now, because we're only letting the user see one row at a time. It wouldn't make sense to let the user select a product in the drop-down list and then page around in the details view. So let's let it go with that. Let's save this and view the page in the browser. There we go. We choose another product, and we see the information about that product. That's pretty amazing technology without writing a single line of code. You've managed to filter this details view based on the value supplied in this drop-down list. And what we didn't look at is other options for filtering. Let's go back here and review again how else you might have filtered. Let's add a new one. I'll just choose the same one again so we can look at it. Here, you can make the source of your parameter be a control. That's what we did already. A cookie, which filters based on the value stored in the cookie, which is attached to the current request. There's a form variable, which is some input control on the form in the current request. A profile lets you filter based on a user's profile value, and we'll discuss profile in a different section of the course. Query string lets you filter based on a value passed in on the URL as part of the query string, and a session variable lets you filter based on data stored in session state. So you have lots of options where you can get the data to satisfy the parameter for your filtering. Let's cancel all this because we don't need to save any of this. Let's test the page one more time to look at some of the features we're missing so far. Well, you've already seen the first issue. That is, if I click delete, we get an exception. Of course, ASP.NET's default error handling takes care of it, but it's not very attractive. Let's come back and run the page again and look for another problem. I mean, there's lots of problems we could find. If you want to make this a perfect application, you have to write some code to fix these things. But let me add a new item. Let's come here. First of all, product name. First of all, notice product ID is gone because product ID is generated for us, and so it shouldn't appear here while we're editing. Let's give our product a name, a supplier ID, a category ID, quantity per unit, unit price, units in stock, units on order, reorder level, and discontinued. Nah, why add it if it's discontinued? Let me click Insert, and fine, we should be able to find it on our drop-down list, but it's not there. No one told this drop-down list to refresh itself. If I shut down the page and reload it, you see it there in the drop-down list. But is it reasonable to ask users to close the page and reopen it to see a new item that they've added? I don't think so. So we need to work around these two issues. I mean, we could find lots of others, but we're going to focus on these two, and that is how do we force this drop-down list to refresh itself after we've added an item, and how do we make it a little more attractive when the user attempts to delete a row where there's referential integrity, which causes it to not be able to delete that row. I mean, there's no problem deleting this row, right? It deletes just fine. It's gone. Of course, we didn't refresh the drop-down list, so there's no data to display. But there wasn't an error. Once we fixed the refresh problem, that display problem would have gone away. But we can't delete this item, of course, because it's used in existing orders. We'll solve both of those problems after we investigate some of the events that these controls supply. Like other ASP.NET controls, DataSource controls raise their events in pairs. One occurs before ASP.NET handles the occurrence that caused the event to happen, and that one can generally be canceled. For example, an event like deleting, or inserting. These occur before ASP.NET handles the deletion or the insertion. And then there's one that occurs after ASP.NET handles the occurrence. For example, the deleted event or the inserted event. These occur after the deletion is handled or the insertion is handled. The deleting event or the inserting event can generally be canceled. The deleted event and the inserted event cannot be canceled. They've already handled it by that point. To cancel the before event, you might write code like this. In this case, this is the inserting event handler. You're handed by ASP.NET a SQLDataSource command event args object as the second parameter, e. And if you set e.cancel, that is the cancel property of that e object, if you set it to true, ASP.NET automatically cancels the insert. This would be somewhat frustrating to users if you automatically canceled their insertion without making some sort of test. They would perform the insert, your code would cancel it, and the row would never get inserted. This is what I would call the user-hostile school of programming. Let's look specifically at handling that deletion error. If you're dealing with data, you need to worry about errors, not just the one we saw, but all sorts of things can go wrong that are outside your control. The SQLDataSource control cleans up after itself pretty well, but you have to handle exceptions. What happens if you attempt to delete a row but you can't? We saw that happen as part of the demonstration. The row isn't deleted, and the exception redirects you to ASP.NET's default error page. Of course, you can always modify the default error redirection in your web.config, but if you don't, you get that ugly page. And you know, the appearance of that page on the public web, when I go to people's websites, has proved to me that ASP.NET has really hit critical mass. I know that people have errors in their sites and they're using ASP.NET. It's pretty clear. You have to write code to handle the event after the exception occurs, but before you get redirected to that new page. The deleted event of the SQLDataSource control makes this possible. ASP.NET passes to you the exception object, and it's passed as a property of that second argument, e. In addition, you have to do one more thing. You not only have to do something with the exception, you have to indicate to ASP.NET that you've handled the exception. Basically, you're saying, I'm an adult, I've taken care of this, you can step out of the way and not do anything. Because if you don't, they treat you like a child, and they go to that exception page anyway. I guess I'm personalizing perhaps a bit too much, but in any case, you must indicate to ASP.NET that you've handled the exception. And you do that by setting the exception handled property of that second event argument, e, to be true. To handle the deletion error, you might write code like this. Notice that we're using that SQLDataSource status event args, e, which is passed to this event handler, and we check to see if e.exception, that is, the exception that just occurred, isn't null. We're running this code whether or not there was an exception. We only want to fall in and do something if there was an exception. So we need to check that. If the exception wasn't null, then we'll set the text of an error label on the page to be unable to delete the row plus e.exception.message, which will tell us what went wrong. It's not real attractive, but it's something. And then we must set the e.exception handle property to be true. So we indicate to ASP.NET that we've handled the error and it doesn't need to do anything. To demonstrate this behavior, I need to start by adding that error label to the page. To do that, I need some place to put it, so I'll go before the drop-down list and hit Enter, so I add an extra line where I can put that label control. I'll drag it in. There it is. I'll press F4 to bring up the Properties window for that control and change its ID to be error label and its text to be nothing at all. There we go. So we have an error label that's empty. You could set some formatting on the error label if you like, but for this demonstration, it doesn't need to be anything fancy. I do need to ensure that when the page first loads, that error label contains no text at all. To make that happen, I'll double-click the page, get the page load event handler, and there set error label.text equal to an empty string. Let's go back to our design surface and now find SQLDataSource 2. There it is. And I'd like to add an event handler for this control. I'll bring up the Properties window again by pressing F4, and let's find the events for this control. As you can see, there are a large number of them, each of them in pairs: deleted, deleting, inserted, inserting, selected, selecting, updated, updating. So 4 pairs of events that deal with the data. I want the deleted event. This is after the control has attempted to perform the deletion. Before it's attempted, we wouldn't have an exception. We have to wait till it's tried and got an exception. So I'll double-click and then type the code you saw previously, which is if e.exception is not null, then what do? We come in and set error label.text equal to something like unable to delete the row. And why is that? Because of e.exception.message. And that tells us why we couldn't delete the row. Now we also need to set e.exceptionHandled to be true. And that's all we need to do to make this happen. Let's save everything. I'll save the solution. I don't know why it's asking here. And we'll go to the products page and we'll show it in the browser. Here we go. Everything should still work as it did, and it does. But let's try deleting this row. Oops, it failed, but it failed in at least a more pleasant way. And that is, it just displayed the message on the page without taking me to some other page. We could obviously make this a little less unattractive. And now if I go somewhere else, the error goes away because in the page load event handler, we told the page to remove the text from that error label. Now you remember our other problem. That was when we add a new row here and we save that new row, nobody told the drop-down list to refresh itself. So we clearly need to add some code somewhere which causes the drop-down list to call its data bind method. But where do we put that code? Let's go back and think about it a moment. Well, clearly it has something to do with data, so we'll look at the events of this SQLDataSource control here. And what event might you use once the user has completed the insertion process? Well, that would be the inserted event. So we'll need to add a little bit of code to the inserted event to hook this up. And this is simple. All we need to do is this.dropdownlist1.dataBind. And that's all it takes to force the drop-down list to refresh itself when we insert a new row. So just like any other place in ASP.NET, it's all about finding the correct event to which to add your code. Let's come back here, save this, and run it. Let's try adding a new row. I'll do the same one I did before. AAA. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just picking random numbers here. 5, 6, 7, insert. And now AAA appears in the drop-down list as it should because we added code to the inserted event. I can't help myself. If I delete the row, I also want to remove it from the drop-down list. So how are we going to do that? Simple. We just need to go back and revisit for the data source control the deleted event handler. Here, if the exception wasn't null, we do this. Otherwise, what do? If it was null, all we want to do is make the drop-down list refresh itself. So we add the same code here, which is dropdownlist1.dataBind. So that should work as well. Let's save everything, try it one more time. Here's the product. We click delete. and it's gone from the drop-down list as well. So you'll see that it's just a matter of finding the right place to put the exception handlers. Well, there's a problem we haven't talked about. Imagine this scenario. I go to edit a row, and at this point, I enter invalid data. That's not a valid category ID. I click update, and of course it has to fail. The input string was not in a correct format. Now you might try to fix this by adding code to an event of the SQL data source. The problem is that this control knows something about the schema of its data, and it's failing before it even gets back to the SQL data source. So for this particular event, you need to handle it in an event of the details view control. Handling events of the details view control is really no different than handling events of the data source. We just need to find those events, pick out the right one, and add the right code. Now, the same issue would occur with inserting and updating. I could pick either event handler, or maybe I put the same code in both, or call the same code from both. Let's make it simpler. Let's go with the item inserted event, so we can trap it for any one of the items when we insert a new row. Just pick that one at random. Let me go to the Properties window, choose Events, and I'm going to go to the Item Inserted event handler for the details view. This one has a few more events like mode change, so you know when it's flipping from edit to new mode or from any one of the modes you get into by clicking the links on the bottom. There's a page index change, so as you move from one page to another, you get an event. In any case, I need the item updated here. In the item updated event, we got to check for an exception. And you know what? This code looks exactly like the previous code. I probably should make a procedure and call it from both places, but instead I'm just going to copy it for right now and paste it down here. So again, we'll either get an exception or we won't. And if we do, we need to update the label, unable to update the row, display the message, and indicate to ASP.NET that we've handled the exception. Let's save it and run it and try that once again. Let's click Edit, type some bad value in here, try to update, and now you'll see that we get the error here and it goes back to the original value. For your homework, what you need to do is try the same thing except apply it to the item inserted event. Make sure you can check for invalid data when the user inserts a new row. Same basic concept, but in a slightly different place in the event handlers. There are a lot of events you might want to trap. For example, you might want to do something as the user changes the mode on this control, or moves around from one row to another. In any case, there are lots of events to which you can add event handlers, and it's your job as the developer to understand what those events are and what kind of code to add to those events.